Hello, my friend and welcome back to another video where we're going to be exploring web components. I recently had Michael on to help me walk through what a web component is and using web components that are already created, but it led to me wondering, like, how can we actually create our own web components? And so, Michael, thank you for coming back and joining me once again, where we're going to be, you're going to help me turn this div that I originally created a while ago for these forms with some validation on it into an actual web component instead. And we can learn about things like the light DOM, shadow DOM, what those are, and everything else that comes into actually creating a web component.
This is great. Thanks for having me. You're like an awesome CSS expert, so I love seeing you branch out into awesome JavaScript things, and web components are my favorite, so let's get into it. I would love to.
Awesome. So yeah, I guess as we saw in that previous video, or if people didn't see it, but that's fine. You'll be able to follow along fine, but I had created this and you'd come across it and said, let's make that into a web component. What's the the first step? The one thing I will say really fast is I had in the original video I did, we were doing a lot more in the JavaScript side of things. I've removed all the validation that I was doing manually. We're going to be bringing that into the web component itself. So that's gone. All we're doing is checking if we submit. We're now getting like the native form validation coming up in here and nothing else. So yeah, how would I start by just having a div with a class on it and turning that into a web component?
Sure. So the first thing is sort of a little bit of ideation of what you want this thing to do, right? So I think a great idea for something that has encapsulated logic, encapsulated features, and sort of configuration options would be just to sort of handle the validation. Because one thing to look for is things that you found yourself repeating over and over and over again, right? So you've repeated the span with the class of error message and the RLIF polite mechanism and some of those things. And anytime you have sort of repeated logic that's true for lots of different parts of your HTML, especially when they're all sort of the same, like they're all in a div, they're all with the same structure, that's really ripe for like a repeatable web component to do in the first place. So it looks like that we've got that great situation here, and we can just start with a custom element instead of a div.
So here, let's just say I turn this into form group instead.
There you go.
And I actually, just really quickly, when I was a teacher back, I remember way back in the day now, it's been a while since I've been in the classroom, but I remember my students loved doing this, where they would just like make up their own elements. And I was like, oh, you can't do that, and then I've even had someone in my Discord community recently sort of talking about the idea of just using custom elements, not even defining them as web components. The one fun thing with this is by default it's inline if you have that, but there's nothing else to it. It's still working probably because of my class that's doing some other things on here, but really like the browser doesn't know what that is. It's just something that it comes across and tries to figure out.
Exactly, and that's sort of the basis. So a lot of people ask what a web component is, right? And we talked about that a little bit in the last video, where the web component is really the umbrella term for a bunch of different sort of browser specs. Custom elements is one of those specs that enables sort of the idea of web components to be possible. And so it's great that you can sort of just make a custom tag. You can style that tag in CSS. Normally, you can sort of do everything you want, and the only thing is the browser sort of doesn't know what else to do with it and sort of treats it like a div or a span of some sort, right? But we're going to give it some logic in a second. We're going to tell the browser, this is not just a custom element. This is a custom element that has behavior. We're going to sort of define it, upgrade it, have some internal logic, probably some shadow DOM, right, as well, and do the whole nine yards.
So how do we get started with that? I'm guessing we have to jump on over to some JavaScript.
Absolutely. So the first thing that we need.
Let's see what we can do.
I'll guide you. It'll be fine. So the creation of a custom element with logic or a shadow root component is essentially two things. You have a tag name and a JavaScript class, and then there's a browser API that hooks them together, that tells the browser, whenever you see this tag name, use this class to run it. Okay. So the very first thing that we're going to start with, I think, is to make a class, and you can name it whatever you want. So maybe form group, right, is a good name. And this is a special class that has to extend the HTML element default JavaScript class.
Extends.
Yep. Extends. HTML capital element. HTML E element. Yep.
Element.
There we go. Yep. So that's the first thing.
Really quickly, are we ever extending anything else, or is it always HTML element?
Always HTML element for the time being. Yeah, there have been lots of sort of browser spec discussions about extending other elements, because people would love to be able to sort of extend a button and get to button behaviors and things. There have been a bunch of reasons why all of those things have so far not gotten very much traction. Like I think the last one, we call it customized built-ins, and it got to Apple, and Apple said no for inheritance reasons, because if you inherit those behaviors, then if they change that class, then it breaks everything using it. Like they had some pretty valid points, but yeah, you're going to just extend HTML element for the time being, and maybe there will be a day when we can extend other elements and get other behaviors of those things built in. The other thing, before we forget, let's come outside of that class, and we're going to go ahead and let's go ahead and hook up the browser API that tells the browser that we're going to associate this brand new class that we've made to that form group tag name that we want, even though this class is not going to do anything. So if you'll come sort of after the class, and on the new line, we'll say custom elements, and that'll be camel cased. So custom capital E elements dot define, and that's a function. And you're going to pass it 2 arguments. The first one is going to be the string tag name. So it'll be just in single quotes form dash group, just like the tag name that we gave over in the HTML.
Okay, so we're defining what
that tag name. Exactly. Mm-hmm. Yes. And then we'll do a comma and do our second argument, and that will be the form group, or the reference to the form group tag. So it'll just say form group just as it is in the class on line 3.
Form group.
That would be a string. We need to pass it as a reference. So let's take the quotes off, and we can sort of refer to that class. There we go.
Yep.
So now, basically, we've told the browser now that there's going to be a custom element called, whose tag name is form-group, and it's going to be run by the form group class that extends HTML element. But we need to make it do some things. Okay. So there's a couple of sort of lifecycle hooks that we need to deal with. The first one is constructor. And so if you've ever written a JavaScript class, or almost any class in any programming language, really, they all have constructors. And this function sort of gets run when this class gets instantiated for the first time, right? One of the good things about web components, I think, if you were to ask for sort of framework developers, like they're a little bit sort of like iffy on JavaScript classes and how useful they are. But for me, the approach for using classes to do web components is perfect, because you have an instance of a component. Like, you're going to have more than one form group on a page, but they're going to be the same thing. They're going to have the same behavior. You want them to sort of share all of this common code, and classes that you have the base definition of, and then instances of them in your JavaScript like memory. It's the perfect representation of what web components actually do in your HTML. So I love this, the fact that you can sort of create a single class, and then you'll have instances of that class for each tag that you put in your HTML that are all separate. They all have different state. They all have different, settings and attributes and all those things. And the browser just keeps them all on off from each other. So the constructor function is, what are we going to do for every instance that gets created? What's when it is created, what kinds of things are we going to do? Okay. So there's a special line that we need to do. So we're going to declare that this component needs to have some shadow root. Okay. So we'll say this. You're going to use the this keyword, right? And then we're going to call a method that is available for any HTML element, which is called attach shadow. So it'll be this dot attach shadow, and then that's a function. So we're going to pass it an object that's going to configure it, and we're going to say mode : open. This is another choice that sort of web component developers have to make. There are technically 2 different kinds of shadow root modes. One is open and one is closed. And the difference is between a shadow root that you can see and access and query, like sort of normal web components if you've ever come across them in the wild, and then mode closed, which would be like your audio and video elements from HTML, where they actually are shadow root elements, but the shadow root is closed and they're not accessible. You can't look at them. You can't open them up and see, what the internal DOM is. You can't query into it. None of the query selectors will work or anything. In this case, I think we'll probably just do open. We don't need to completely hide all the shadow root internals from folks. So this line will say to the browser, give this component a shadow root that we can use, and give it a shadow root property, and give it an inner HTML and all of those fun things.
Yeah. Just really quickly, is there a specific case where you might want to use closed? Because I can't, for this type of stuff that a regular person would be working on.
I guess conceivably, it would depend on how much you want to lock your component down.
Okay.
I genuinely think that these days we're probably going towards not locking components down as much and sort of leaving them more open. There could be use cases, I guess, where the internals are so complicated or so verbose that you would just sort of hide it all. But I think it's going to depend a lot on who your sort of consumer base is and what they're going to be using for it. If it's going to be something where they need to have like testing capability or something to use some internal parts, like there's a button inside that they need to click with testing or something, so they have to query it, then just mode closed just won't work. But if it's a component that could be completely black boxed in that you don't have to like interact with any of those elements inside the template, then maybe closed could work. But I've only ever written mode open. I've never written a closed one.
So it's more of a niche, and if you're in default to using open, and if you have a very specific use case, maybe then
exactly.
Perfect.
And that's part of like the way that the Shadow Root sort of spec was originally produced, is that the Shadow Root and Shadow DOM was available as an internal browser feature for audio and video for a long time, and sort of the addition, the creation of custom elements and web components was sort of exposing that private browser API as a public API. Right. And so part of the reason we have open and closed is that the browser kind of had open and closed before, because there's actually a browser setting that you can turn on where like inputs are actually shadow roots. Like you can turn on C browser shadow root, so you can see that a native input when you turn it on through DevTools actually is just sort of divs inside. It's sort of just divs that have other things in it, which is very curious. But you couldn't tell without that special browser setting to turn on view browser shadow root. I forget what the setting is. I have it on forever, but
I have it in my other. I'm running Canary right now, and I didn't have it set up here, but normally I can see it. Yeah.
Yeah. So this line is going to say we're just going to sort of stick with mode open. In a little bit, we'll sort of do styles, but let's go ahead and set up our internal shadow root template, which is sort of what is the HTML that is going to be the guts of our component. Okay. And so we'll just do that now. Now we have a sort of shadow root property. So we can say this dot shadow root dot inner HTML. Yep. And then we can set that equal to some HTML. Now you can get a lot more complicated than this. You can there's lots of different ways that we can sort of make this template be reactive and change when things attributes and properties change. For this use case, we don't need to change this template at all, so we can just sort of set the template and then manipulate it with CSS and JavaScript. Right. So for this case, we'll just do a string, and we're going to say this string is going to contain some HTML in it, and it'll just say angle bracket slot. We'll sort of put a slot element, and we'll open and close it, and then after that, we'll put a span for our error message.
Okay.
And
error.
Yep. So we'll do error message for sure. And the original one over in the index.html that we're going to be replacing is using an ARIA Live polite technique where to announce it to assistive technology, the span has to always exist, but it'll update when its content changes. So that's another reason why we don't really have to update, dynamically update whether or not the span is or is not rendered. We can just sort of always render the span and then change its contents, and then the changing of the contents will announce with ARIA Live polite, which is great.
Yep. So perfect.
So we can just copy that, and now we have an internal template, right? And so if we could see where this is used, right? Now we should be able to see if we've used it in the HTML. We should at least be able to see that span appear for any place that we've.
Because here, where I have we have
to delete that one. Yep. Do we have this? Do we have our script linked? Or we're working on form group.js? Yeah. Do we have it linked? Yeah. Okay. And then we're calling our define.
Name is that's okay.
We're not getting shadow yet. We may need super. You may need to add super in the constructor.
Super.
Yeah.
Be right here. I think super.
Yes, that might. There we go. Okay. Yeah, that was a step I missed. Missed. Yeah. So calling super tells the constructor to run the constructor of HTML element first, because we want to construct the parent class so that we can become an HTML element. So without that, you're not doing anything and attaching anything, and your inner HTML stuff's not working. So we'll call super, and then we'll have our shadow root with our slot and our span, and everything is fine. Yeah, nothing has changed visually, because when the slot is available in the template, then all of the children elements of that foreign group tag are put into that slot. So we call this slot here the default slot, which means it does not have a name on it, a name attribute, right? And we call it the default slot because when you put a slot with no name, then the browser says all children of that tag that you've defined will get put into that slot tag and sort of projected in there. So by doing that, we've said the label and the input go as children of that slot, and then the span comes after both the input and the label.
Right. Yep. Perfect.
Okay. So that's pretty much our constructor. We'll do some styles in a minute, but first we want to do we want to do styles first, or do we want to sort of set up event listeners and things?
I guess let's do an event listener just so we can see the error message do something maybe, or even just for styling or whatever it is. But yeah, let's do I guess a simple one maybe just to go down that route. Yeah.
So for event listeners, we're going to do another sort of lifecycle hook, right? Because the constructor for a web component runs before the element is actually sort of on the page. Okay. But there's another lifecycle hook that sort of guarantees us that the component is actually on the page. It's actually part of the DOM and being drawn by the browser, right? Yep. That lifecycle hook is called connected callback. And it's a function that runs every time this element is mounted to the DOM. Theoretically, this could be called more than once, so we want to be careful about what we put in here, because if you take an element and unmount it and then remount it, like if you're using JavaScript to sort of move an element and you unrender it and re-render it somewhere else, but you save a reference to it in JavaScript, then technically this connected callback can be called more than once. So we want to be a little bit careful. But I think for this simple use case, we can set up our event listeners there, and that's where we're guaranteed to have the children, existing, and we're guaranteed to be we're in a DOM. We have DOM APIs we can use. The constructor we're not necessarily guaranteed yet.
Okay.
So we'll do inside the class still sort of after the constructor. So we'll new line after 13. Yep. We'll do connected callback as camel case. Yep. Oops. Yep, that's perfect. And then we will start establishing our event listeners. Okay. So the first thing that we're going to do is we need to know our target to set all of our event listeners on. Okay. And in this form, we have a mixture of sort of inputs and text areas, but pretty much everything is either an input or a text area. So we need to find probably just the first one or the only one, right? We're not guaranteeing that nobody will ever put in two inputs inside of this web component, but we're saying that if you put a second one, the component's not really going to use it. It's going to use the first one that it finds, right? So I think we could just say, we could declare, but we probably want to hold on to a reference to that thing. So at this point, I would set up a private property on the class so that we can hold on to the reference of what the input is that we found. Okay. The way to do that is let's come up to the very top of the class, and we're going to declare a new class property on line 4, and let's call it input, but we're going to spell it with the pound sign, and then input. Okay. And then a semicolon. Now, what that's going to do is it's going to establish a new class property, and you'll sort of refer to it by going like this dot pound input, right? Okay. But it's private. This is JavaScript private variable. So from the outside of this class, you would not be able to sort of use that input property, right? Because it will be private to only this class. Right. And then in the connected callback function, we'll use it and we'll sort of set it. So we'll say this dot pound input equals, and then we'll do a query selector. And this one is fun because this sort of can show you the difference of querying from inside a shadow root, right? Or from inside a web component, because you can query both light DOM and shadow DOM, and it's a little bit different. Okay. But this time we want to query light DOM children. So we can say this dot query selector. And then we're going to pass it the selector that we want, which is probably just input, comma, text area, something like that, right? Just inputs and text areas. And we'll pass it as a string. So query selector takes a string. So all of that stuff is going to be wrapped in single quotes. Yeah, wrap the whole thing. So we're going to pass it one argument. So it'll be quote, input, comma, space, text area, quote. Yeah, exactly. Yep. CSS select.
Yep.
And then, so now, for every instance of this class, when it's connected to the DOM, that input property, that pound input private property is going to be set with whatever the reference is. Now, we're expecting that there is one there, so we're not going to handle the null case of what if there isn't one, right? We're going to go simple. And then we can use this input property to start adding event listeners to our component. So maybe we should check to see if there is one there. So maybe do an if, if this input, this pound input, because we only want to add the event listeners if the input actually exists, right? Then we'll say this dot input dot add event listener, and we need to give the event name. So we're gonna pass two params. The first one is a string that's the event name. So let's do invalid for this one. We need an invalid event listener, and let's just put a function reference here that we'll fill in later. So we'll just say pound handle invalid or something.
Handle invalid. We'll have it
there you go.
For now
that's just going to be that it's not defined yet, but it's going to be actually it'll be this dot handle invalid.
Right.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah.
That's all right.
Okay. And then we'll fix that in a second. But let's sort of copy this line and do the same thing, but we're going to do it with two other events. We're going to do input and blur, and I can tell you what these are going to be about. The reason we need an invalid, input and blur. Yes. And we don't need the if for every check. So let's just do the single if and then, no, that's good. That easy copy paste. So just,
there you go.
That's the one. And then,
and then this one was the on input. And this one was the blur.
Blur, exactly. And then maybe our handler functions are handle input and handle blur.
Perfect. Handle input, and handle blur.
Do we want to leave some comments for ourselves to know what we're doing?
Sure.
So the handle invalid is going to be turn off the browser pop-up. We're gonna use the invalid event to turn off the native browser validity pop-up. The input event, we're going to use that to hide error messages when the user starts typing. And the blur event is going to be to validate and show error messages after the user's done typing.
User leaves AP. Perfect.
There you go. Cool. So that's essentially the setup. There's a little bit more to it, but we'll get back to that in just a second when we sort of define these handlers. But the important thing here is to talk about, and this is something that authors of web components deal with a lot. Okay. Event listeners are tricky because they have a reference to the element itself that the event is attached to. And if you don't clean up your event listeners and remove them, then you can lead to memory leaks. You could have listeners that are don't have any attached elements that are just in memory and all these kind of weird bad things, right? If you're adding an event listener to an internal element that is internal to the Shadow Roots template, like if we added an event listener to our span that we wrote in the template, then that event listener is automatically going to get cleaned up by the browser if our form component ever goes away, right? So we don't have to worry about sort of internal ones. But this one's a bit different because we're actually adding an event listener to an external element in the light DOM that isn't necessarily going to get gone away just because our form group component gone away, right? Went away. So we have to sort of spend some energy in cleaning it up ourselves. And so we're going to use another lifecycle hook for this, which is the disconnected callback, which is this will get called whenever the form group web component gets unmounted from the DOM. So this is one of the reasons why we set function references to handle our events, because we need to do it. We need to sort of use this for cleanup, because the only way you can remove a listener is removing it by the reference to the function that you called. So we have to sort of save it as a reference. So what we'll do here is we'll say this dot input remove. Actually, let's do the if as well, just in case if we don't have an input and we don't have to remove, right? So the same sort of if the input exists, then we'll do this dot pound input dot remove event listener.
Remove event listener.
Yeah, and it's pretty much the exact same structure as the adds above. Yep.
Invalid and I'll just
this dot handle. Yep. You could probably copy all those lines and then just change adds to remove. Yeah.
We'll do that one, and I'll clean up the indentation because I probably don't have prettier running. Nope. And then so that would be a copy that, and both of those can be removed.
There you go. So this will ensure that if our form group component is ever unmounted from the DOM for any reason, that those event listeners are also removed. That way, we're not. If let's say there was a situation where the component was unmounted and then remounted, unmounted, remounted, unmounted, remounted. If we didn't clean up, we might have 6 listeners that are all on the same element, and you'd have all different kinds of things firing twice and 7 times, and so it's pretty bad. Yeah. So now we'll be cleaned up, and we'll be pretty sure that we only have one event every time it's mounted. Should we implement these handlers? Should we do?
Sure. Yeah.
Figure them out. Okay.
Yep.
So let's do the invalid one first. I think that one is the simplest one. And we're going to make a function that has that same name. So pound handle invalid. Somewhere above the callbacks here. It doesn't really matter where. Yeah.
Handle invalid.
Yep. And that's going to be a function. And it's going to get called by the browser when the event gets triggered. So we're going to need that event as a parameter. So you can just say e, yep. And then the very first thing we're going to do that turns it off is e.prevent default. So that says prevent the default behavior of whatever the browser was going to do because of this event. So that just turns off the pop-up. That's the easiest thing. And then we probably also want to sort of work on displaying error messages when this happens. We can do it on blur, but I think we can also do it on invalid as well. So we can get to that in a minute. We'll sort of do the logic in blur and then copy it into this invalid handler. The next one to implement would be the input. So let's handle the input. Now remember, we're going to use this input event to hide error messages while the user is typing.
Yep.
Correct? So for this one, we actually don't need a reference to the event at all. So you can just sort of leave the E out. Okay. We don't need that one at all. But we still want to check to see if there's an input. And if there's an input, then we need to sort of erase the error message from that element, right? So another thing we can do is we sort of need a reference to the error message span, right? So we're going to sort of back up a little bit here and get ourselves a reference to that span that is calculated whenever we want. So there's a couple ways you can do this, but if we go up beside input and add another property.
Sorry, we're
on line 4. If you go up beside input,
all the way up. Yep.
And make another private property, you can say pound error message. And then you can set it equal to this dot shadow root dot query selector, and then pass it the selector that we want. So it can be dot error dash message or span or whatever it is in this case. Now this query selector is actually querying in the shadow root now. So we're not querying light DOM children anymore. We're querying our own shadow root inner HTML template that's from line 11 to 14. Yeah, what querying is there now.
Yep.
So back inside our handle input, we can say if exists, right? If we have that thing, then we're going to set the text content of the error message to be nothing. Now this is part of how we're handling error message styling and displaying and assistive technology sort of announcing is that the error message is shown when it has content in it, when it has text in it, and it is hidden when it doesn't. Then we'll get to the styles that do that in a minute, but that's the approach that we're going to take because we need that span element to stay there all the time. And so the approach that we're going to do to get it to read out is to fill it with content when there's an error message and then remove the content when there's not, right? When there's no error. So we'll say, this dot pound error message. So we're going to use the text content property. We could use inner HTML if we wanted to, but we're sort of only doing text. So text content that makes sense, equals empty string. So this is just saying erase the content, and when it is empty, it'll be hidden. So we'll sort of hide the message. Good so far?
Yep.
We'll check in. Is everything making sense? Everything's sort of feeling right?
I'm following along so far. Yeah, it's perfect.
Perfect. Okay. So then the last step, I think, would be to implement the actual sort of error checking. And this is where it gets a little bit more complicated. So we're going to implement the blur handler because when the user tabs off the field, we're going to sort of, we're going to check the browser's default validation and then use that to display our error message. Okay. So we're going to have handle blur. That's exactly right. And then we're going to do a little bit more complicated if check. So if the input exists, so if this dot pound input, and so the double ampersand, double ampersand.
There we go.
Yep. So we're going to say if it exists, like if it's not null, and it's invalid. So so we can sort of use the default validity state of that input that the browser is automatically going to calculate for us and do this check. So it'll be if this dot pound input dot validity dot valid
T dot valid.
But now but we need to reverse that because we say if it exists and it isn't valid, then we're going to do something. So we're going to put it. So we're going to reverse that with exclamation point, right? So in this case of we have an input and it isn't valid, then we need to display the error message, right? So we're going to do the same line from above in the handle input, but we're not going to set it to empty string. We're going to set it to some sentence that is the actual error message. For the time being, we can just say this dot error message dot text content equals, you done goofed or something. We'll set it to a string and we'll come back and customize it in a second. There we go. Yep. So now that should work for when you blur off, right? Unless we've done something wrong. Oh, yes. Okay. There's one other thing that we need to do. In the connected callback,
yes,
the function that we've passed, so the this dot handle invalid, this dot handle input, handle blur. By default, and this is a little bit tricky, this trips up people a lot. By default, that function is called with the scope of that function. It's not called with the scope of our class. So the this keyword it corresponds to the target element that the event was emitted from, not our class. Okay. So on all of those functions at the very end, we need to add a dot bind with parens of this. Yeah. This, yeah. If you're doing events this way, it can trip people up a little bit, but basically what we're saying here is take this handler function and call it bound to our class instead of bound to the target element, right? And then inside of our handler now, this keyword will be referring to the class that we're writing and not the target element that the event was emitted from. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. It's weird looking at it. Yeah, I understand.
It trips people up a little bit sometimes. Yeah. So now we're saying, call that function, but then bind it to our class. So that's definitely one thing to do. We may need to log out and sort of see to make sure that it's being called. This would be a good thing to do.
Okay.
Do you want to just sort of put a console log in our handle input and just sort of make sure that we're...
Yep. Handle input. Console log.
Yep. And then that should... Oh. Query selector. I know why. Okay. Let's fix this. What's erroring is the error message property. I gave bad advice. So, so remember when we talked about the only way you're sort of guaranteed to have DOM and have the shadow root property is in the connected callback. or after the connected callback function has run. Well, our error message property on line 5 is doing a query selector, but the DOM doesn't exist yet. We're not in the DOM yet when that property is applied. So a good way to do this, I like to make a sort of a getter function that will just be evaluated whenever we sort of want to pull the value of that property. So we can change this, and we'll come down to after your constructor, and we're going to say a very similar, you can do it after the constructor. Doesn't like formatting doesn't matter. If you were, if we were in design system land, we want all our components to be consistent, but we're not, so it's okay. We just need a property. So we're going to be inside the class. I think right now you're outside of the class, but we still, so we'll say get error message as 2 words. So we'll use the get keyword, space, and then lowercase e error message.
Get.
Space.
Error.
Message.
Message.
And that's a function. That's going to be a function. So we're going to have parens and curly braces. And then we're going to return the same query selector that we had in that pound error message private thing, which we can now delete. So we'll copy that shadow root query selector and paste it here, but we're going to return instead of setting that prop. Keep deleting until you get past the equal sign.
Sorry.
There you go. There we go. So now what this does, this is essentially defining a property, but it is defining a property as a function, as a getter function, essentially. So once this is defined, you can use this like this dot error message the exact same way you would have used the other property, except that you're sort of giving it more behavior. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yep.
You're not merely setting a value, you're doing some computation, right? And so to keep our code working, let's add a pound in front of the error message on line 58. That will make it a private property. And that should get rid of our errors.
Good sign.
There we go. There we go. All right, now we're working. So now we've got our event listener, right? And that's working. I think we've only put the form group on the first element so far. So that's
just form group. And now we get it showing up on both of them. Perfect. Awesome.
There we go. And we don't have styles yet, so we haven't so basically the span element always exists for the time being. That's why you saw the extra space happen. We'll do the styles in a bit. But we've got the basic logic of handling the input, handling the blur, and turning off the browser default validation.
So now if this is invalid, if I start typing, it immediately goes away because we set that up
to be empty. Exactly.
On the handle input right here, we're removing the error message while I'm typing. Perfect.
But there's still a problem. No matter what the error message is, as long as it is invalid, the error message will always say invalid. And we probably want to give people more information about what the actual problem is, right? And so we want to give them a little bit of a customized message, sort of depending on the kind of invalid that the value is, right?
Right.
And there's a couple of different cases. We talked about in the last video that it's, value missing is sort of the constraint, the default constraint validation case of the input is set to be required, but you don't have a value in you, right?
Yep.
There's a bunch of other ones. There's too long, too short. We talked about, pattern mismatch, range underflow. So we probably want a custom sentence, a custom phrase for each one of those situations. And then it's probably a good idea to have the user be able to customize that somehow, because our defaults won't work for every use case. Sometimes you want to have an error message that is that says something, please enter a first name for this field, but the component, this form component, doesn't know that it's a first name input that we're surrounding. We don't know that kind of thing. So, but the next step would be to make sure that our text content of our error message on line 30 is not always just a hard-coded string, but is sort of a configurable error message that it has configuration from the outside, but then also default, so you don't have to send anything if you don't want.
Yep.
So shall we set that up?
Yes, let's do that.
Okay. So the first thing that we're going to need to do is I think we're going to need to figure out what the error message should be. Okay. So I think a good thing to do is do another one of those getter functions, but in this case, it's going to be for the error message. So maybe let's make another get, and then let's call this property custom error message. And that's also going to be a function, also with curly braces. Yep. Now, the thing that we probably want to return here is, at least the thing that makes sense to me, is like a lookup object that's directly aligned to those, like the cases that can be wrong, and then the sentence or the phrase that we want to display in that case. Okay.
Right.
So I've taken the liberty of sort of like writing all these out because there's a lot of them and it's sort of pretty repetitive. So if we want to just paste in the object here, and we can sort of talk about
there we go.
how that works. There we go. So all of these properties in red are the direct validity properties that exist on any sort of HTML form element by default. So any input type text or type number or any text area, any radio button, you could query selector it and then get its validity.value missing property, or its validity.too long, validity.too short. It goes right alongside that validity valid, which is the overall. If any of those things are invalid, then the validity.valid is false. And so for each of those cases, I think it makes sense to me to sort of align my lookup based to the names of those specific states that I want to handle.
Yep.
And then, so those are the keys to the object that we're going to use to look it up. And what's going to be cool is we'll be able to pass that validity, like the object in that validity, directly to this lookup as the key to look up the message that we want to grab for it. So we can sort of pass it straight to it. And then the right side of the value is our customization and our default. So we have a big OR that is either the value of an attribute that we're going to support or a default sentence, whichever one is defined. So if the attribute is defined and has a value, then we'll use that. And if we don't, then we'll use the default.
Perfect.
It's a pretty clean way to sort of offer a customization, but then also have a default and just keep them all in the same place. And this, since it's a custom getter function, it's going to get evaluated every time that property is requested. So every time we write this dot custom error message or pound custom error message, it's going to evaluate this lookup. It's going to call the this dot get attribute every time. So this is automatically sort of accepts changes to the attribute. So if the user, like the consumer, were to change the value of the attribute from dynamically, then it would be updated in real time. And the next time it would be the component where the input was invalid, then it would change that attribute's value and show you something different.
Yep.
So we need to we have our lookup object, and now we just sort of need to use it, right? And so the way we're going to use it is first we need to like get a sense of what is the error message that we want to display. Because remember we talked about an input can have multiple things wrong with it, but we really only want to display one error message at a time because that's a better user experience. And we don't want to list 6 things that are all wrong. So given that all of these things could be true at once, like all of these invalid states could be true at once, we need to have some mechanism that kind of decides between them which one is the one that we want to choose to display. So for that one, I just wrote another one. You can just write another little getter function. And I think I call this the get first invalid.
First invalid.
Yep. So we'll do get space pound.
First invalid.
Yeah, or first invalid is fine. Yeah. And actually, let's just make it, let's not make it a getter. Let's make it a regular function. So let's take the get away and we'll just have it be a function that we call. There we go. And this function is going to be responsible for deciding which thing that we want to display, right? So we need to loop through all of the keys from the native validity state of the input. Not those, the ones that actually come from the validity object and the input, right? Mm-hmm. We want to loop through them and find the first one that's invalid, essentially. Okay. So we'll do a for loop. So we'll say for const key in validity state. And this is actually going to be a variable. And so let's pass that in on line 62 to the get first invalid function. We're going to actually pass that validity state along. So yeah, add it as a parameter to the get first invalid function on 64. Yeah.
Wait, sorry.
We're good. So in the parentheses on 62. Right. So we're going to add validity state there. So we're going to pass it into that function and then use it. So we're going to loop through all those keys, right? And then we're going to say if validity state square brackets key, right? Now I'll explain this in a second. Then return key. Okay. So what happens is if you were to look at the validity object, you can actually pull it up if you want to. If you want to console or open up the console,
Yep.
and inspect one of the inputs, you can actually grab it and then go to your console with it highlighted and type $0, which is a shortcut for this dot query selector, this element, right? Dot validity. Yep. Now expand that open, and you can kind of see all those objects, right? So it's basically a big object. Can you not like?
Can't seem to expand.
Oh, you can't give it an object structure? Oh no. It's super helpful to sort of kind of see it as an actual object. Maybe hit enter and it'll echo it. Maybe.
Oh, right. Yeah.
There we go.
Thank you.
There we go.
I was like, this normally works. It just has where's the arrow? There we go.
Okay. So in this case, like valid is false because there is a value missing that is true. So the validity object is a little bit backwards in terms of the way that it's structured. The way that it's structured is like if you're reading this object, it'd be like, it is true that the value is missing.
Right.
Right. So the truthy state is whenever those cases are truthy, they are invalid. Okay. So that's essentially what our loop is doing, is to say if the validity state of the key is truthy,
yes,
then return that key because truthy means it's invalid for that reason.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So that's our get first invalid function, and we're just gonna that's gonna find the key, and that key is the key we're gonna use to look up from the custom error message what sentence to what phrase to use.
Yeah. Because whichever of these, then it matches what.
It's a little bit convoluted, but basically we're sort of passing the keys around from the validity object to get the sentences that we need, and then customizing them with attributes, right? And so if we go back to our blur where we're handling the use case, instead of setting the text content to that string of invalid, now we can set it to something more clever. So we can say this dot custom error message. And then we're going to
custom error message. There we go. Yeah.
Yep. And we're going to pass it an array, or it is going to be an array, right? Yep. And the key that we need is the one that comes back from first invalid. So if you want to just copy the line from the code there, I took the liberty of sort of writing that line out in the code, and then we can sort of explain what it's doing. There we go. So the custom error message is returning an object that we can use square bracket notation to sort of get to the key of. The get first invalid is taking in the input's validity and returning the key that we're going to use. Does that make sense?
Right. Yes. So yeah, we're getting this custom error message, get the first invalid, so then it goes through gets that, finds the first one, matching it to what we have here to get the message that we've written.
Exactly. Yep. So it could be
the text
if that were like not as readable, like you could definitely expand this out and sort of like do not do it all as a one-liner. To make it sort of more readable to know what's going on. But essentially this is looking up in the custom error message lookup object via the first invalid key from the validity of the input.
Yep.
So now if we were to save and blur, right, then when it is invalid, now we're getting the default. Now we're instead of getting the invalid string, now we're getting our default case. And then we can sort of jump over to HTML and double check that the attribute's working as well. So we can come over here and say value-missing-message equals something that looks different than the default, and we'll sort of know that it worked. Hey, there we go.
Perfect.
Awesome. So now we have that validity. We have a custom error message. We have a default error message. We've got user experience things of not showing error messages while people are typing. And I think the last thing to do is style it. I think we've got pretty much everything to do except for working on the getting this thing styled.
Awesome. And I was about to say, I haven't written any CSS in a little bit here. I'm getting antsy.
We'll take care of you. I got you. So to style in a web component, especially we're all very vanilla, very native, right? If you were using a library like Lit, it would handle the stuff sort of thing for you, sort of under the hood, and make it very easy. But we're going to sort of do this the native way to show how you would do this sort of vanilla web component from scratch. Okay. So what we want to do is we want to create a style sheet essentially in JavaScript, and then adopt that style sheet into the shadow root of the component so that the styles in that style sheet become shadow root styles and become encapsulated in things. Okay. So what we'll do is you can actually instantiate a new style sheet in JavaScript. So we'll just say const, form group styles equals new CSS style sheet.
Yes. New.
Yep. CSS. Capital S style.
3 S's in a row. The style.
Yes. Yep. And that's a function. So you'll say function, and then you don't have to pass it any parameters or any curly braces. You can just put a semicolon and be done.
Yep.
So we have our form group styles is our new style sheet.
Style sheet. Perfect. Okay.
Exactly. Yep. Now we have to fill it with some rules, and this is kind of a really funky API. I'm sure it's named for a good reason, but we can say form group styles dot replace sync. And replace sync essentially says it's a function, and we're going to pass it a big string. The string is going to be the CSS to replace all of the rules for this style sheet, right? Okay. So this is basically an API that's like replace all of the rules of this style sheet with this string of CSS that I'm going to give you. Now, there aren't any rules in here yet, so we could sort of add instead of replace, but replace is easier. Right? And then now we get to write some CSS. We get to write some regular CSS, and we get to write some sort of special Shadow DOM's web component CSS. Okay. So the first thing that we want to do is set up our error message span, sort of being hidden when it's empty and being shown when it's not, right? And I know you've done videos about this before using the empty pseudo selector.
First message empty, display none.
Yes, exactly. Yep. So when it doesn't have any content in it, because remember our approach is the span always exists. We're going to fill it with text when there's an error message, and we're going to delete the text but keep the element when there is no error message. So we're always going to have that span.
If I find that, it should... Oh, no, I was going to say we should see it, but we haven't attached that to anything yet.
Not yet. Nothing yet.
Yeah, we're creating the styles, but then we have to actually
hook it into the component first. Yep, okay, exactly. Perfect. And then the second one is we need to make this a color. We probably want our error message to be red, right? So I think the best strategy for this is to use a CSS variable for this. Yep. So let's just sort of, assign the color of error message to be a CSS variable that we want to, or a custom property that we want to just name. I think error message color is a good one, right? But it can be sort of anything you want here. Now, this one is interesting because what we're saying here is we are not necessarily going to, we could define this custom property in this CSS. But if we do that, and if we do it here in this dot error message sort of class selector in the shadow root, then it actually won't be able to be reset from the outside of the shadow root boundary by a consumer, right?
So before we go on that, if I did root here, that would work.
Root would not work here
because I was like, there isn't really a root because we can't access the HTML element. That's okay.
Nope.
Perfect.
So what we can do here is, and this is a technique that I like to use for sort of what I call public CSS custom properties that are usable. They're designed to be set from the outside, right? So from the perspective of the web component, it's that these CSS properties are part of the API of the component. I want consumers to use them to do configuration things on purpose, right? Yep. The way to do this is to use the variable as if it exists, but set your default color as the fallback in case it doesn't, but never to set it to a value.
Yes.
Because you want it to be overridden. that make sense?
Right. Yeah. So because if you define, like if I define error message color, then it's set because we can't redefine it, or the user from the outside can't redefine it. Whereas if normally custom properties are inherited, so it will, if somebody sets it in a regular style sheet, it would come in and actually apply.
Exactly. Now there's one exception, so we can do this if you want. There's one exception to that rule, which is if you define the variable or the property in :host, in the :host special sort of shadow root selector, then it can be overwritten because :host specificity is very low. So you could say :host -- error message color : and then whatever the fallback you want it to be, right? Then it can be overwritten, but only if you set it in the host selector. If you set it any sort of like further down in another selector that isn't host, then it'll be in part of that encapsulated CSS and won't be able to be reset or overwritten.
Okay,
right.
Cool.
Host is kind of special because host means the tag name itself. So the :host that we're selecting is the actual form-group element itself, but we're selecting it from within the shadow root boundary styles. We're like reaching outside a little bit. And so that's one of the reasons it has low specificity, is because we want the outside world to be able to win on that tag, not the styles itself. Because the way that I think about it is, I think of the host element tag itself as the outside, and the shadow root elements, the DOM template, as the inside. And as the custom element author, I own the inside, but I don't own the outside. And so I want the application developer, the consumer of my component, to own the tag itself that I'm defining, right?
Yes. Yep. That makes sense.
Making sense?
Yep.
So this is a way you could do it as well. It's a little bit longer than just sort of putting red, on the color prop where you're going to use it. But it's the same approach. It's essentially the exact same thing. You could define a variable in host. It can be overridden, and then it's used with no fallback on your property that you want to use it on. Or you could not define it and then set your fallback color as a fallback where you want to use it.
Yep.
Either way,
it gives you the same result at the end.
Exactly. Yep. The one's shorter, one's longer. Sort of your mileage may vary about which one you want to do, but they're functionally the same. And then the last thing we want to do is attach this style sheet to the component to sort of make it style sheet shadow root styles. So we're going to use the adopted style sheets property that's on our shadow root. So we're going to come inside the constructor because we're not doing DOM stuff, so we can do this inside the constructor. And after we attach shadow, we can say this dot shadow root dot adopted style sheets equals, and this needs to take an array. So we're going to pass square brackets and then our form group styles variable that we created above.
Form groups.
Yes. And now we should have a red error message that is also being hidden and shown when not filled. So we should see the query type. Yep. It's overridable. It is hiding and showing. And there's our styles.
And so if I went just here quickly, this was some things we were playing with last time that I didn't get rid of, but we can talk about that in a second. But here we'll say that if I just did...
You've got error message color on 1117 already. But
1 second then. I was going to ask about that. So if I have that, and then that's blue. So here, error message style... what did we call it? Color. Color is yellow, which we won't be able to read. That's not coming through. And then if I did it as...
there is one thing to talk about. So there is actually a subtle difference between the two approaches. Let's I forgot about this.
No problem.
So if we go back to our JavaScript, if you define the variable like this, where you're defining a host and then using it deeper, you can set it, but you can only set it on that element. So you have to select the form group element first. You can't just do it on root because it's being set on that element. So you have to reset it also on that element.
That makes sense because I
tend to do the fallback.
yeah, that's the exact same thing as like I'm defining something here, and then on a regular whatever my form group, and I say my error message color is green, whatever. Like this will take precedence over what we have there. So it's the same thing that's happening.
Exactly.
Where
so I tend to do the other way, where we just sort of set the desired sort of default color to be the fallback. That way the root one will take precedence, and it's sort of easier because you don't have to select that element specifically. You don't have to do tag name selectors and things like that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Go. Perfect.
Now there's one other feature that we could add if we wanted to sort of give ultimate support to our consumers, right? Because again, we're in shadow root land, and so we're very encapsulated, and so we only sort of give configuration options that are allowed. Technically, it's JavaScript and HTML, so you can do anything you want to. It's just sort of clunky to reach in and add things if you want. But if we want our user or consumer to sort of be able to style something that's more than just the color, we've got to do one other. We have to give one other thing, because we could probably add some more CSS properties that style other things. But we currently don't have any things like padding or background color sort of already established with defaults. So a good thing that we could do is add a CSS part to our error message that will allow outside CSS to select that part and then style all of the CSS properties on that element if their need arises for that.
Right.
Does that sound like something we should add?
Yeah, that sounds useful.
Okay. So if we come to the span class error message, we're going to add a part attribute and give it a name.
That's easy.
Part equals, and then error message or something. Yeah, something like that. That's all we really have to do. The part is a special attribute that will that translates into CSS, and it purposely it pierces the shadow root boundary using the : part selector function. And so if you want to do that in your CSS, now you can select sort of form dash group : part parens, and then give the name error dash message, right? Now you can style lots of things. You can style padding, you can style background color, you can style border radius. You can sort of do whatever you need. Yep. There are a couple of things to know about this, but both from the consumer perspective and from the author perspective. One is that the part name is not a selector. And I actually love that it's not a selector as a component author, because it being a sort of just a string, a name that's not necessarily connected to the DOM element that it lives on, means that as the component author, I could move that part around to different DOM elements and not break anything, as long as the part name is still sort of has the same reason to exist, for the component when I make changes. If it were a selector, and maybe I changed what classes were in my template or something, I changed what IDs or what, whatever, I might be breaking that selector. The fact that it's just a string, sort of a name that's not connected to the DOM element that it lives on, means that I can maybe move it around a little bit and then not break anybody's sort of CSS that they're styling from the outside at least as much, or not as much, which is great. Yeah. And the other thing too is when you're styling a part, you only get access to the DOM element that the part is on. You don't get access to any other combinator. So you can't do children. You can't do sibling selectors. You sort of can't select around it. Again, this is shadow encapsulation at work. But when you style the part, you get just that DOM element. You don't get anything else.
Yeah, that's a good thing to know. Because, so if you did want to expose, like say we had, I don't know why, but you had another span in here, this would, internal message or whatever, and then you could have that as its own thing that people could select if they needed to.
Exactly. So that basically what ends up happening is that, web component authors have a collection of CSS properties that they use for customization, and a collection of parts that they use for customization, a selection of slots that they use for customization, which maybe have names. Maybe you have a let's say you wanted an icon or something to potentially be there for your message. You could add a slot that called icon or something, and it may or may not have an icon in it, but that's a customization option where the web component could provide like a fallback content of like, if you don't provide an icon, I'll provide one for you, but then you can override it with your own one. Yeah. There's lots of different things, but parts, CSS properties are all, and like attributes and things are all different ways that web component authors can provide config, options that are baked into the component that are, usable by consumers.
I guess what the question that leads me to is, how do you, if you're creating a web component, how do you decide if something should be a part or if it should be done with custom properties, or if it should just be something that's in the light DOM that users then put in themselves?
To be honest, it's really difficult to decide that. I think it's a function of just your sort of mentality for the component, what it's going to be doing, who your audience is, how locked down you want it to be, like how important is it that the error message is red? If it is very important that it is red, then maybe you don't provide configuration options, right? Yeah. But maybe it doesn't matter what color it is, and maybe it doesn't matter if it's got padding, things like that. It's all just sort of a function of what the author sort of needs and what the needs of the consumer base are. And so I tend to start like try to like ride that line of it's a balance between flexibility and value, because as a design system developer, right, my job is sort of to provide value out of the box. And in order to provide value out of the box, that kind of means making some stylistic decisions sometimes. And so I might decide it's red, but the second part of that is sort of being open to changes of, if my community says, no, I need to be able to configure this, I've got valid use cases, then I can always push a new version of that component and give you a part or give you a property or something. So we're always trying to ride that line between if the component you're making is the most flexible it could possibly be, then you're probably getting in the way, and you probably have too many, like your API of properties and parts and things is too big, right? And you're not providing as much value as you could be. So, but making those decisions is a point of inflection where it's like, well, maybe I don't want it to be red all the time. So there's always that balance of and it's kind of hard to decide. So sort of use your judgment and know your audience kind of decision.
Yep. Perfect. Okay. Gotcha. That because as we were going through it, I was just like, I could see how I wouldn't know which one to do. My instinct is I would feel like if like things like the custom properties make sense to me in terms of like, these are, as you said, sort of like the API, these are the pieces you're allowed to touch. Whereas as soon as you do a part, you're sort of handing control over. So in certain, again, there's times where it'd be like, oh yeah, okay, this makes sense for here. But in my mind, I probably would be using this the most. And then I guess the other thing that's hard to decide is, when is something actually a part of the web component like our span is, versus letting the user bring in the pieces light DOM instead. And there too, I guess it completely depends on the use case of how the user's using it. Because in this case, I'd like this form group to work no matter what the person's styling looks like. So it makes sense that they can just class form group and style it how they want, or just on the label, the input, however they're doing things. And then we're automating the error messages primarily. So keeping this is user defined, and then the error message handling and all of that is happening through the web component. So it depends what the purpose of the web component is and everything else.
Exactly. And I think that's something that like web component authors that do this a lot are constantly running up against when it comes to like browser APIs. Like when you talked about the handing over control, that we're kind of like, it's either all, nothing, or just a little tiny bit. Like there's not very like, there's not very many ways to like hand directed control of these things to a consumer. So take a slot, for example. There's no way for me to say that a slot should only really have icons in it. A slot is any HTML, anything. So like the component might be designed for an icon, but when a consumer uses it, they can put 45 paragraphs of text and completely break it. But there's no way for me to, as the author, to say like, don't allow things that aren't icons. Like don't allow things that aren't this element, right? The same is true, like you said, of parts and of CSS variables, right? There's no way for me to say, this CSS variable is there for changing color, but I kind of only want reds. Like I don't really want pink. I don't really want white. Like in this case, we had white. Like white is totally doable here. Like the technology will let you, but it's a terrible user experience because you can't see the error message anymore. So like if I'm building a component, I'm always like trying to figure out, okay, well, if I make it just hard-coded red, then I know that it'll be accessible on the background that I know about, but then you put this on a brown background or something in your app, and then it's broken, then you can't change it, right? So there's always this trade-off of, flexibility and value and all or nothing, right? And we just sort of like, it all comes down to sort of documentation of, this is a slot, which means you can put 45 paragraphs of text in it, but please only put an icon, like stuff like that.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I'm really happy with that. I learned a lot. Was there anything else that we haven't covered yet, or did we get through it all?
I think, just to say congratulations, I think you've written your first web component. Is this your first web component that you've written?
Basically, yeah. I've played around with some stuff before, but nothing that it's been sort of piecemealed from other things. So this is the first time I've actually sat down and like authored it from the beginning. So yeah, pretty happy with that.
These APIs are very low level, but I think that's part of their power. And so they're a little bit clunky, but once you sort of get used to them, the ability to provide sort of framework agnostic, pieces of encapsulated functionality, behavior, style, and template is amazing. Yeah.
Awesome. If people do want to learn more about web components, they're sold on them. What are some good resources? Do you have any things they could follow for them to learn more?
Oh man, that's I think one of the cool things about it is that like it's literally MDN. It's literally just the browser, the browser documentation itself. You can sort of look up what's shadow roots. You can look up, the connected callback hooks and things. You can look up all these things and learn about slots and learn about adopted style sheets and all that. There's probably a trade-off there too, because there's no such thing as the standard way to write a web component. And so you can go look for, bloggers and influencers and technical folks out there, and everybody's going to tell you sort of how to do it differently. And so like there's a beauty in that you can write it however you want to and sort of do it however you want. But there's also a struggle because there's not one definitive way that everybody agrees on. But MDN is your friend. You'll sort of learn anything about those. There's lots of different like great libraries that you can sort of use as inspiration. So like WebAwesome and Shoelace are like are great libraries that you can just sort of go and look and see how those things are done. All the code is open source, and you can just sort of see, what choices are they making and why, and some of those things. There's lots of good like web component libraries for bigger companies. You can go look at Adobe Spectrum, there's any number of different sort of web component like design systems nowadays that are able to go at least look at the doc site, maybe not the source code, but you can check out sort of the choices that they're making. But yeah.
Cool. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for walking me through all that. I really appreciate it. Learned a lot along the way. And thank you for your time.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. It was a blast.
Yeah. And for everyone else, thank you for watching. I hope you really enjoyed it as well. And of course, until next time, don't forget to make your corner of the internet just a little bit more awesome.